Hello all, welcome back to the new lecture. In this lecture, we are going to discuss about accessing and modifying Mule event. As always, I promise you, if you understand this lecture, then you are going to score 100% in this section in your actual MuleSoft certification exam. So let's start it. Let's start from the basics about Mule event object. What exactly happens inside your Mule application? There are series of activities which occur when your event source receives a trigger. What is trigger? Trigger is a starting point for your event flow to get triggered. It can be your HTTP request, it can be your VM connector which is listening to queue, or it can be just a scheduler or HTTP request. So any of these act as trigger. Their job is to just the start your flow. So when your event source receives this trigger, it generates one Mule event object. We will see details about Mule event object in a minute, but then when this object is generated, the Mule event travels sequentially through all the components of a flow. What is this Mule event? Mule event comprises of Mule message and variable. If you see this inner square bracket, Mule message comprises of attributes and payload, and Mule event comprises of Mule message and variable. You would have seen this diagram so many times till now, but it is important from exam point of view. In exam, they might ask you some questions. For example, variable is part of Mule message or Mule event, or what is part of Mule message. So it is basic, but yeah, ensure that you know this diagram by heart. Now, what do you mean by attributes? What is inside attributes? When your trigger request is coming in the Mule message, if it is HTTP request, then there can be headers or query parameters or URI parameters or some security additions. All those are part of attributes. So those are basically metadata. And then comes your actual payload. What is payload? Payload is your data. It is your it is something that needs to be processed by your flow. So if you take example of HTTP request, then HTTP post specifically, then in post you whatever you add in the body section would come under payload. If you are reading a file, then the content of file would be part of your payload. So that way, whatever is the actual data that needs to be processed is always included in the payload. This Mule event object is immutable. What do you mean by immutable? Every change to an instance of this Mule event object results in creation of another instance of Mule event object. Whenever any attributes or payload changes, a new instance of Mule event is created. Now, if every time new instance is getting created and in the flow in between my processing, if I want to access the instance that was received, then how do I receive it? Because in between flows, it would have been changed. So in that case, what we do is we save this initial or at any instance, whatever state you want to save the instance, you save it in the variable. Variable can have any kind of data, payload, or just variables like you have in C. It can hold anything and it comes to rescue. So this variables can be accessed throughout your application across various flows as long as you connect the flows with flow reference. Let's take first example of flow reference. Here, what I've done is in parent flow, I have Mule event consists of attributes, payload, and variable. So here I am showing the original Mule event. Then here I am showing Mule event which is being passed from flow reference to the child flow. Then here is the updated Mule event in your child flow. And when your flow goes back, then here is the latest Mule event available for logging or transforming. So in the exam, you will see multiple permutation combination around this Mule event attributes. So it might ask you questions like, what will the value of attributes after having, flow reference call, HTTP request call, or VM connector call, and same with payload and variable. In those case, you need to concentrate you need to understand in depth what is being passed to child flow, what is being updated in child flow, and what is being sent back to your parent flow. All these three things are extremely important. Let's start with our first example. In this case, our Mule event consists of original attributes, payload, and variable. When we call flow reference, we are passing this original Mule event to the child flow. So all these attributes, payload, and variable are accessible in child flow. Now, if you do not do any transformation, then these original attributes, payloads, and variables will be available in your main flow. But what if you update them? How do you update your Mule event? How do you transform your Mule event? If you want to change your attributes, you need to use transform. If you want to replace your payload, then you can do it by using set payload within your subflow. Or if you want to replace your variable or update your variables, you can use set variable, and then you can update your variables. So when you receive original attributes, payload, and variable, and you're using transform attribute, set payload, set variable, you're transforming and updating all these Mule event parameters. And when you're sending it back to your main flow reference, all these three will be updated one. So here, if question asks if your original attributes or original payload is accessible, your answer would be no. But another permutation is, what if you're not using transform here? Then your attributes are not getting changed here. What if you're not using set payload here? Then your payload is also not getting changed. If you're changing only set variable, then only your updated variable will be available in the flow reference, in the main parent flow. So it depends on what they are doing. But all the permutation combinations can be thought from this one diagram. So keep this very well in your mind. See how the original Mule event is being passed to child flow. See if it is getting transformed or not. See what parameters are getting transformed and what are getting returned back. Based on that, you can answer this question very well. Now let's see another example where we are calling child flow using flow reference, but in this case we are setting payload in target variable. Here, when you pass attributes, payload, and variable from your Mule event to flow reference, all of them are accessible as is in your child flow. You get all these values as is, and you can then update them. Now, if you're using transform activity for updating attributes, you can transform your attributes. If you're using set payload within your child flow, your payload will be updated. But in this case, when you're updating your payload, updated payload is saved in a target variable with the name that is given by you in the target location. So and again, let's see the last part as well. And variable, if you are using set variable in your child flow, then your variable will be changed. But when you go back and you send it to the you send the control back to your main flow reference, here how they will be accessible. Attributes which were earlier present in parent flow would be now changed because you use transform attributes in child flow. Your payload, this payload you updated in your child flow, but you saved the updated payload in the target variable. So your existing parent flow payload would be accessible as is. And if you want to access payload from your child flow, you can access it using the target variable. And in exam question, they sometimes might save the target in target variable called as payload, but that is payload variable which will be storing child flow, not the actual payload which is coming from parent flow. And then variable, so here you will see variables is gray, and now here it is changed to skin color. So these variables are updated here if you are using set variable. So there can be so many permutation and combination in exam on this one. If they send all these values and they just update set payload to and save it in target variable, but they do not use transform, they do not use set variable, then all these three values will be accessible in your main flow after flow reference as is. Nothing will be changed. If you are using attribute, if you are just setting variable and you are not doing set payload and you're not doing attributes, then only your variables would be changed, and those change variables will be accessible here. And in case here you as seen in earlier example in set payload, if you're not using target variable, then your original payload will also be replaced by the new payload. See you in the next part. We had discussed about Mule event object. Now let's discuss more about HTTP Mule event object. So in HTTP Mule event object, you must be using Postman or SOAP or HTTP client ARC maybe to trigger your flow. Event source, when it receives that request, then it processes it as discussed earlier. But in this case, what happens is if you see HTTP request object, it has header and payload. In this Mule event object, you do not have variables. In attributes, you can have all the method, host details or query parameter, URL parameters, and in payload, you can actually have your data which needs to be processed. But in ARC client or Postman, you never see that you can pass variables, right? So this concept is very important. HTTP Mule event object does not have variables in it. Now let's see what happens when we call HTTP request. When we have HTTP request call from parent flow for your child flow, let's say, here you when you have Mule event, but when you are sending request, what will be done is in HTTP your variables are never ever passed to your child flow. In exam you might see that here they are using particular variable with the same variable name. They are having some modification in your child flow and asking you what is the variable value. It will remain unchanged in your main flow. In HTTP request you can never pass variable. And when you are passing attribute, when you are creating HTTP request for your child flow, you are replacing attributes and payload while sending it to child flow. So in HTTP request, within your next flow, will your original attributes and payload be accessible? No. Here only updated attributes and payload are accessible. So this I am talking about HTTP post request. It has no variables, but it does have payload because you are going to post that information. For example, post employee information or post book information. So your attributes and payload in your parent flow have been updated, and when you send response back, now here attributes and payload will be updated one, but the variables would be unchanged. Attributes and payloads would be updated one and variables would be unchanged. Now let's take an example of HTTP request where if we are having HTTP GET request. Now when let's say from your Postman or your ARC, when you're hitting HTTP GET request, what happens? Do you send body? No, because you are getting the results. You are not posting anything. So it can be get employee ID, get book reference, or whatever. In that case, what do you pass in request? You just pass attributes. In the attributes, you may pass query parameters like where employee ID equal to 1, where book ID is equal to 1 to 3. But you can never send body in your HTTP GET request. So body comes in your payload and query parameter, URL parameter, headers, everything that you rest of the things will always come in attributes of HTTP request. So in case of HTTP GET, what happens is you're not able to pass any payload, you're not able to pass any variable to your child flow. So of course your child flow is not able to update those payload and variable. So in your parent flow, payload and variable remain unchanged. But attributes in request parameter, when you do HTTP GET call, you have to generate new attributes while passing request to child flow. So here if you see attributes is in gray and here it is green. So they have already got changed here, and when you go back to your parent flow, your attributes would be the updated one and not the old one. Now let's talk about VM connector. In VM connector, if we use publish consume, it is a synchronous flow. It publishes message on queue and it waits for the response back. Here we have HTTP listener, then we have set payload. Here we are setting value to high in payload. Then we have publish consume. It will publish the message on queue, then it will wait for the response back. Here in the set payload, we are updating the value of set payload to hello. Now this guy is updating your payload from hi to hello. And when you response back, updated payload equal to hello will be going to your logger. And in the logger, you will be printing payload as hello. If it is just published, then whatever you do here, it is a synchronous call. So it won't be seen. And here in logger, if you print payload, you will see hi. So in exam, keep an eye if it is publish consume or only publish. In certification exam, usually you get questions like you're adding one to your payload. So here you have set payload to one, then you are set adding it here and then you are coming back. Another thing here is target variable. What happens when you set target variable value? So in this case, what you're doing is you are updating the payload updated to hello in your flow variable flow to value variable. So rather than replacing the payload, you are updating hello in the flow variable and your existing payload remains as is. So in this case, what you're sending back to your main flow is flow to value variable hello. So in logger, if you want to access your original payload, you can access using payload. And if you want to access payload from your child flow, you can use it, access it using the variable name.